Here's a question. Is Anthony Edwards more overrated right now than Rudy Gobert is underrated? Plus, we'll talk about whether Jimmy Butler is going to join the Brooklyn Nets for some reason. And we'll preview the Central Division. We got lots to get to on a jam-packed, locked-on NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On NBA, your daily source for all things NBA from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for joining us, making us your first listen. Appreciate you guys checking out the show Monday through Friday with all of our great hosts like John Corrales, Jake Madison, Pat the Designer, Nick Angstadt, Wes Goldberg, Adam Mares. We got and Jackson, of course, on Mondays, who I was with last night talking about all things Nuggets. Appreciate you guys joining us and making us part of your day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. My name is Matt Moore. I'm the senior NBA writer for the Action Network, co-host of Locked On Nuggets. I'm joined by David Ramil. He's co-host of Locked On Heat. On today's show, we'll preview the Central Division. Can the Milwaukee Bucks once again rule this division for like the 700th year in a row, or will the Cleveland Cavaliers finally get their stuff together and get over the hump? Plus, who's the sneaky team in the Central Division? We'll talk about the Wolves and a perception problem. I've been thinking a lot about this. There was a great piece from John Krasinski in the Athletic I want to get to that talks about kind of where the Wolves are at perception-wise with some of the comments from Shaquille O'Neal and others. But we'll start today, David, with a little bit of a trade rumor, a little bit of a free agent rumor, I guess is a more accurate description. There is the notion, the idea, a suggestion that Jimmy Butler might wind up joining the Brooklyn Nets next season after his contract expires. Obviously, he's spending his last year of his deal with the Miami Heat. That's been agreed to by both parties. We'll see kind of like what happens. Butler is known to be, quote, fond of the Brooklyn Nets and is open to the team, sources told Brian Lewis of the New York Post. So there's a little bit of breadcrumbs here. As a guy that covers the Heat daily and covers Jimmy daily, what was your reaction to this little piece of news?
Not surprised. Interesting to think that there's already a team that is a potential suitor for Jimmy's services next season. I just don't know how it's going to play out. I mean, I think there's so many different paths that this could go in. One, if there's the idea that Jimmy is looking for greener pastures, and I mean greener in terms of actual money that some team might be willing to pay him, then I don't see a world in which Miami would keep him on the roster. I think they'd have to entertain the idea of trading him mid-season, and that being the case, well, who knows where they'll trade him to? And of course, that makes things a little bit more difficult. There'll be a reduced number of partners that might not be interested in acquiring a Jimmy Butler because, well, if he's not intending to sign there or they don't have the money to sign him there, I don't know how it's going to work out. It's a risk. It's a gamble for any team that's going to acquire a 36-year-old player that may or may not be past his prime. As far as Brooklyn is concerned, look, we debated this on an earlier episode of Locked On Heat today. It just kind of feels like that would be a move towards, you know what, I'm going to take the big paycheck. I'm going to compete a little bit, but the pressure's off. And I've kind of just accepted the fact that maybe competing for a title and having to carry a team isn't really realistic. I mean, as good as the Nets might be a year down the road, if they acquire another free agent star, if they somehow win the Cooper Flag sweepstakes, that makes them an interesting choice for Jimmy, but not a contender, certainly, and not even probably a playoff team with a 36-year-old Jimmy Butler at that point, almost 37. So it's just, it's just interesting to see all these news taking place here. But I'm glad that it's been upgraded from he likes Brooklyn to he's fond of Brooklyn. That's always a positive thing. So, I'm curious to see how it all plays out, but we've got a whole year to figure it out, basically.
Just did a quick search, and I can't find any tennis events at Barclays Center for 2026. So I don't know.
No, but they do have coffee there, and I think Big Face Coffee would probably do well in Brooklyn.
Open up Big Face Coffee in Brooklyn. Yeah, so I don't really get this. I don't really understand this from either side. So if you're Butler, this is your last kind of hurrah. I understand the idea of getting one last big contract, and certainly the Nets would have the money to do so. And I get the idea of like, hey, I want to be in Brooklyn. Like it seems very much like a nice retirement plan, like an early retirement. It's just kind of surprising that a guy as competitive and as fierce as he is going to go out like that, where it's like, yeah, we'll just, I'll play 40 games and make 30 million and just going to hang out in Brooklyn and, enjoy my life.
I don't think it's 30 million though. That's the whole thing. And I totally agree with everything you're saying. And I thought about this too, didn't say it on the show, but I mean, just in conversations with Jimmy and the way he kind of acts and has acted throughout his career, we always kind of saw it under the guise of, this guy's ultra competitive. What a gamer. He always brings it up during the playoffs and kind of a jerk. A lot of people said that about him in various different spots throughout his career. And now in Miami, it's kind of warmed up a little bit, but the thing is, he's got so many interests off the court.
True.
And you just see him being kind of like, you know what? I'm going to get my 50 plus $60 million a year from Brooklyn, if that's the case, or something significantly higher than whatever Miami could offer him. And I'm kind of just ready to take that paycheck and just kind of just like gamble, watch soccer, make coffee, have my own vineyard. I don't know what's next for Jimmy Butler, but something, take up trapeze artistry. I'm not sure. There's going to be something in his future that he's going to go 100% on board with. And if that's the case, I could totally see it. It's not so far-fetched given everything that Jimmy has done over the course of his life and career.
Yeah, I think from the Nets perspective, I also don't get it from the idea of like, okay, you're definitely aiming for Cooper Flag this year. That's what you're trying to get. Right. Are you going to then pay Jimmy this big contract to come in and hang out and be like, I guess, mentor Cooper Flag? If you're Joe Tsai and you just lived through the Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant experience, what on earth makes you be like, you know what I want to deal with? Jimmy Butler and his personality and how much he influences a team and how much of a ruckus he can cause when he thinks things aren't going the way that they need to be. Like, that seems insane to me. I can't think of it's okay. I want to make this very clear. Jimmy's very successful and Jimmy works very hard. It's just that, like, what you don't want is like your young influenceable superstar being influenced by a guy who has basically said, I don't care about any of you, do what I want, his entire career, who has absolutely taken zero prisoners, who has provided no compromise, who has burned every bridge. Like, that does not seem like a guy that I want as like the model veteran for my young superstar I want to build a franchise around. So for me, like, this makes zero sense from a Nets perspective, regardless of how much Jimmy wants to do all the things that New York provides.
Yeah, no, I absolutely get that too. Like, I could not see why Brooklyn would have legitimate interest. And it adds some legitimacy to the team. Again, you can kind of sell. It's like, oh, we've got our new superstar and our old superstar. We've got a bright future, short-term and long-term. Like, well, you were setting up. We're back, baby. Brooklyn is back. But at the same time, like, Jimmy's not a mentor. Like, it's okay. He's going to push buttons. He's going to tweak a few people here and there. But I just don't. That is not the template necessarily that you want to at least have within the locker room for a young superstar like Flag. If he winds up being that player, and he's going to get challenged, and maybe he responds, who knows? Maybe it works at a level that we can't foresee. But I wouldn't take the gamble on it. And I like Jimmy. I like Jimmy probably more than 90% of most media members, and I still think that it wouldn't be a great idea.
We'll see what happens and whether or not this is something that gets revisited closer to the deadline if things don't go great with Miami this season. Up next, here's a real basic tease. Is is Anthony Edwards more overrated at this point than Rudy Gobert is underrated? We'll talk about the Wolves and the perception problem they're having up next here on Locked On NBA. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. What's something that you'd love to learn as an adult? Do you make time to learn new things as often as you like, or was that lost in childhood? I love learning languages. That's the thing that I really love to learn. I also like, there's all these things about science in the world that I'm always really fascinated by, but I don't make enough time to really learn about them. Kids are always learning and growing, but as adults, sometimes we lose that curiosity. What's something you want to learn? Gardening, a new language, maybe how to finally beat your best friend in bowling. Therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder, because your back-to-school era can come at any age. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Rediscover your curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Back here with David Ramil on Tuesday. Thanks for joining us on Locked On NBA, for joining us live on YouTube. Appreciate you guys checking out the show at youtube.com/LockedOnNBA. You can catch video versions of this show and all of our shows from all of our great hosts. All right, David. So I want to kind of talk about this because we're still in the depths of the offseason. And there has been, I think, an interesting kind of arc with the Wolves, right? Where they explode last season. They take over. They're the number one seed for most of the season. They finish third. They topple the defending champion Denver Nuggets in a 7-game series. They get absolutely waxed by the Dallas Mavericks in the subsequent round. Then in the Olympics, Rudy Gobert is benched, and there's all sorts of conversation about that. And that whole thing, Anthony Edwards is part of Team USA. And at this point, like, there's an interesting kind of dichotomy. Anthony Edwards made a lot of waves for his comments about Michael Jordan recently, and that's caused things like Rasheed Wallace on his podcast, which, boy, Rasheed just fires off some takes. Just takes from Sheed. Sheed said that, like, Anthony Edwards is basically Derek McKee, which, wow. And so there's all this stuff, there's all this stuff going back and forth. And then you got Shaquille O'Neal, who was asked who's the worst player in the NBA, and he says Rudy Gobert. Now that's Shaq, and Shaq says what Shaq says, and Shaq has his feelings on centers, etc. And like, it did what it was supposed to, which is it created a lot of headlines. But I think we're in an interesting spot with the Wolves going into next season, where Mike Conley's 32, Rudy Gobert's 31. Anthony Edwards is on the rise. Edwards, because of how he played early in the Nuggets series, really just like the first three and a half games, kind of emerged as this big, as like a superstar, as like a true awesome superstar. And everybody was really in on him. And he was like burning extremely bright at that point. Kind of tailed off because the Nuggets changed their coverage on him late in the series. He had a very quiet game 7. And then, struggled again with a different matchup versus the Dallas Mavericks. He was good for Team USA, wasn't like explosive, but you can't expect him to be with the guys on that team with, LeBron and Steph and KD. Like, he played his role and did his job, and he won a gold medal. Right. We've talked about on the show about how putting the Wolves on opening night is kind of a signal that the league believes that Anthony Edwards is like one of the faces of the league. Like, they're really all in on Minnesota because of Edwards as like this new face of the league. On the other end, you have Rudy Gobert, 4-time defensive player of the year. And I'm very fond of, and I love talking about this, in that we have an inability to accurately rate Rudy Gobert, where early in the season, when he was early in his career with Utah, it was like, man, like, this guy Gobert is really awesome. Like, he's extremely good. Like, he's hugely impactful defensively. And then the Jazz got really good, and you had the analytics wonks being like, he's one of the most impactful offensive players in the league because of his screening and pick and roll and offensive rebounding. And everyone was like, well, I mean, no, because like, he can't hit a hook shot, and that's a problem. And that continues to be an issue. But now you have like the other side of this, which is there's perception, people talking about how he gets played off the floor in the playoffs. That was true back when the Jazz were facing the Rockets. He couldn't handle James Harden and that coverage. But Rudy's gotten a lot better at those things, and he's been hugely impactful, and he was a monster in that Denver series. They do not win that series without Rudy Gobert, despite them winning the game where he missed. He's hugely impactful, and they're better on the floor without question by a wide margin with Rudy on both ends of the floor. And so my question for you, David, is we've got Anthony Edwards being talked about as a superstar and a face of the league, and Rudy Gobert being talked about as the worst player in the NBA. So my question for you right now, and it doesn't have to be either. You can say neither are true, but who do you think is Anthony Edwards more overrated right now in this moment than Rudy Gobert is underrated, or vice versa?
I don't think Ant's overrated at this point. I think there's a need for the NBA to try and find somebody young and American that can kind of carry the torch in terms of who is going to be the face of the league. We talked about it in a recent episode. LeBron's getting older, Steph's getting older. Obviously, they're still there. KD's getting older. You've got some players, mostly European, and Joel Embiid, who are, have been the best players individually in the league over the last few seasons. So if you're going to try and find somebody to be the face of the league, it's probably Ant. We made that point again episodes ago. So I understand the marketing behind it and the push. And look, he's a fun and exciting player, and what he does in the court is something that's easily translatable to peripheral fans. Conversely, I think what Rudy does is not translatable to peripheral fans. I think, one, he played most of his career in Utah. Who saw him there? They had their nice little runs, but I think the same way that Donovan Mitchell might not necessarily be viewed by casual fans, Rudy Gobert isn't viewed the same way either. Like, you could be really good and you can play in Utah, and guess what? You're still stuck being, watched by 15,000 fans. And I think he's underrated at this point. I think everything that he does offensively, defensively, like, there's incredible value in it. The narrative about him being played off is a great point by you. I think it's been ridiculous for a couple of seasons now. And I just don't know if fans understand how to accept Rudy Gobert and what he does, because he doesn't put up these monster numbers. He's much more subtle and nuanced of a player. And I've made the same argument about what Bam Adebayo does, and I think you can apply it in some regards to what Rudy does. And so I think when you're looking at a fan, if you're a fan on the outside, not necessarily, like you said, an analytics wonk, you're looking at what he does. It's like, oh, okay, well, he's got, 13, 12, and 2 blocks. Like, that seems like a pretty good number, but it's also kind of pedestrian in terms of like what really stands out. You want those 40-point plus games. You want these monster numbers to stand out at you. And I think Rudy's just he's never going to put up those kind of stats. And that's fine. And so that's one. There's also the French thing. And I think it bears noting that, I think a lot of people just don't know what to do about Rudy Gobert because he's French. And, he's, I won't say he's not media friendly to the same way that Joker isn't, but I think there's a certain personality, and I don't know that it necessarily comes across with incredible warmth, again, to the most peripheral fans. I happen to like Gobert. I don't have any problem with the way he interacts. There's also the COVID thing. I mean, right after that, where he touched the microphones and he became patient zero for the NBA. It was ridiculous. There's no point in even debating it. Like, who knows how many people may have tested positively for COVID at that point in time, or who would have been responsible for the fact that he was touching microphones and everything else like that. It doesn't help. And so you've got this whole large picture, a mosaic that is just something people cannot decipher. And I don't think they can appreciate or like what Gobert does. And it's kind of weird to see a guy like Shaq single him out as one of the worst players ever. It's ridiculously impossible. Gobert's actually a darn good player, but to even view him as a bad player is just patently ridiculous. And I don't know what that is. Maybe like you and I were talking beforehand, he's got his thing about centers. I get it. Like, nobody's going to ever satisfy him. It's Dwight Howard, Andre Drummond, whoever. They're all lined up in the crosshairs for Shaquille O'Neal. But it's really weird. So I don't think Ant is overrated. I think he's maybe overhyped, and that might be a little different. But I think Rudy is definitely undervalued at this point.
Yeah, and I think it's tough because so Rudy is a high contract player, right? But part of the key with the playoff stuff is that there are times when you will be better matched up against the opponent without him on the floor. The reality of that is that if you're actually just talking about defense, like, there are times when the Dallas Mavericks would be better off without Luka Doncic on the floor, without Trae Young on the floor, without when the Denver Nuggets would be better without Nikola Jokic on the floor defensively.
Right.
But you obviously would never take them off because of their offense, because they're built around those guys' singular talents. And this is one of the problems, I think, is because egos and money and pride are so big in the NBA, because these guys are so competitive. Like, this is a thing I'm really big on. It's why I'm so confident in the Thunder, is Isaiah Hartenstein is already, even though he signs this $30 million contract, Hartenstein's like, yeah, now if I need to come off the bench, that's fine. Like, that's what you need. You need to be able to be like, hey, whatever wins us this matchup in the playoffs, that's what matters. Because for 82 games in the regular season, there is not a better night-to-night, more impactful defensive player than Rudy Gobert. Maybe Victor Wembanyama becomes that this year. But for right now, it's Rudy Gobert. I will say that in the playoff environment, there's no more impactful and valuable defensive player than Bam Adebayo. And like, that's just like, that's who he is. But like, night to night across the 82 games, Rudy has more value than Bam because of how the regular season is played. And that's important. The one thing I will say, there's a really good article on Ant by John Schumann of NBA.com rather, that talked about kind of some of the things that Ant probably needs to improve on, and some of the things about his game. And a lot of it's just like the highlights. When Ant has it going, he is so unbelievable. There is a Kobe-ness to him. Like everyone makes the Jordan comparison, but there's a Kobe-ness to him in that when he has it going, it feels unstoppable. But when you take the big picture step back, like he shot 35% from mid-range. That's really poor for a guy that shoots as much as he does. Like he's got to get that up to 40% or better. If he gets it to 45, now you're talking about one of the most elite players in the league. But like Ant is given kind of all of this credit as already being at the level of some of these other guys, when it's like the gap between Anthony Edwards as a scorer and Kevin Durant as a scorer, despite the fact that Ant kicked Kevin Durant's ass for 4 games in the playoffs, that gap is very wide because Ant's not as consistent, and he's got to get that consistency up. Now he's young, but I do think that as we kind of talk about these guys, I will say that I do think that we're a little bit ahead of the curve here on Ant, and I hope he gets there. He's he's explosive and fun, and he is a dog. And that people respond to that. You kind of mentioned like the Gobert thing. Ant's the opposite. People connect with Ant's charisma and that dog in him.
Yep.
But he's actually got to do the thing. And that to me, I think is important for the Wolves going forward. Up next, we're going to preview the Central Division. Last week we started with the Southeast. We're going to talk about the Central Division. We'll give you our division winner, who we think finishes last, and who's the sneaky team in the Central Division. We'll talk about that up next here on Locked On NBA. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Well, we've got something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. I had a great day betting yesterday. I was on Cowboys. I was on Buccaneers. Those were my 2 biggest plays of the week. Snuck out Colts plus 2.5. That was an insane sweat. That was absolutely crazy. What was not a sweat was Steelers Falcons under. Good God, such horrible offense in that game, but it was a great day to bet. I'm going to be on the Miami Dolphins this week on Thursday Night Football, and you can check out those odds at FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. We'll be right back on Locked On NBA. Final segment here on Locked On NBA. Thanks for joining us, Matt Moore and David Ramil. We're previewing all the divisions leading up to the start of the season. We got just enough time for us to sneak these in. And so we started last week with the Southeast Division. You can catch our takes on that, including David's thoughts on the team he covers, the Miami Heat. We're going to move on today and do the Central Division. We're going to give you who we think is going to be the winner of that division, who's going to finish last, and then we're going to give you the frisky team, the team that we think is going to be sneaky good in that division. Obviously the Bucks have won this division, I think, 6 years in a row. And so they've been absolutely dominant in this division. They were especially dominant under Mike Budenholzer. Got close last year, but then the Cleveland Cavaliers, for reasons unfathomable to me, decided to tank the last day of the season and ruin all of my. I had a lot of bets on them as division winner, so I'm a little salty about that Cavaliers performance. But David, going into the season, the Bucks roll it back. They add DeLon Wright, Taurean Prince, Gary Trent Jr. You got the Cavaliers, the new coach Kenny Atkinson, rolling back mostly the same team. You got the Bulls, you got the Pistons in this group, and obviously the Indiana Pacers. Who do you think is going to win the Central Division in 2025?
This is so much tougher than the Southeast Division, obviously. Like, there were 2 good teams there. You can make a case for either of them, but given how Orlando generally tries to approach the regular season, I pick them as the favorites. But looking at this team, like 3 really good teams, all with some questions, but all really good and capable. And I had a really hard time figuring this out. To me, I was just kind of basing it on, I think, by just sheer superstar talent and what he's done there, what they're capable of, the boost that they'll get from a new coach, or not a new coach, but somebody who's got a full season in play to kind of mold his team his way. And look, he's never been criticized necessarily for his regular season approach. So I'm picking the Milwaukee Bucks. I think they'll win it. I think they're somewhat underrated at this point, kind of flying under the radar. I think the moves that they made are pretty good to kind of shore up some of the depth that they may have lost over the years. And I think if Chris Middleton, and this is a huge caveat, if he's healthy and he can continue to add what he has in the past, I think they'll be much more dangerous than they were last year. I think Dame Lillard's going to feel much more comfortable in his role. I see them being a 50-plus win team pretty easily, and I think they'll win the division. But you can make a pretty strong case for either Cleveland or Indiana, who I think they're not necessarily flying under the radar after what they did last year, but they're a good team. They're just as capable as the other two.
If Atkinson gets the Cavs to click, they're going to win it. I think that they are good enough because the Cavs really have they've had these stretches where they look like the best team in the division, one of the best teams that are a true contender. I'm going to say Bucks though. I'm going to take the wimp way out of here.
Hey.
Mostly just based off of I went back and I just looked at Giannis's numbers. Like 30 points, 11.5 boards, 6.5 assists. He shot 75% at the rim. So much went wrong for them last year, and they still wound up winning this division. Like, so much stuff went wrong for them last year, and they still wound up winning the division. Their win profile is taking a big hit with the departure of Mike Budenholzer. Like, Mike's really good at just, like, winning the games. He knows how to manage the regular season. He learned that from Greg Popovich in San Antonio. His teams in Atlanta did the same thing. His teams in Milwaukee did, and we'll see if that happens in Phoenix. The Bucks last year, though, were a lot more unstable. They lost to more teams under 500. They weren't as good there. They used to be the most dominant. Like, one of my favorite things to do betting wise was just bet the Bucks in every single division game. They were so good versus division opponents. These teams that they know that they play multiple times, they would wreck them. And that really tailed off last year. And it's not just because the Pacers and Cavs are better, but it was it was the Bulls too. And so I think the margin for error for Milwaukee is lower, but they're still, with Giannis specifically, the best team. I still have concerns about the defense. Doc Rivers, I think, is in an interesting spot as coach where, look, his teams are good. Like, he very rarely has, it's very rare that Doc Rivers has a top end roster and underperforms to a significant degree. He might go like slightly under or to expectation, but he does not underperform consistently. He also just doesn't like maximize. You don't see like Doc's not putting in 60-win seasons anymore. And so I don't know what to expect from that end. I'll go ahead and I'll say Bucks here, but I think it could be a real race down the stretch once again. And maybe the Cavs will just once again inexplicably tank so that they wind up with the Celtics in the second round. God, what a stupid decision that was. Okay. On the flip side, this will be I'm very interested in this question, and you may think it's a very like obvious and simple one. Who's the worst team in this division?
I think it might actually be the Chicago Bulls. I mean, who knows what's going on with Zach LaVine? Is he going to be healthy? Is he going to play? Is he going to get traded? Like, who knows what his future even is there? If they find a mover or a team willing to take him. They lost DeMar DeRozan, their best scorer by far. They lost Alex Caruso, their best defender by far. I mean, I like what they're building there, and they finally seem to have some kind of identity there with Josh Giddey, and I think it's going to be interesting. We talked about the backcourt a couple of weeks ago. It's an interesting team. I just don't think they'll be very good either. And then you look conversely with Detroit, and I think for everything that JB Bickerstaff was maligned for in Cleveland, I think he's going to get a lot out of this team in Detroit. I think he's going to be the right voice, the right temperament. He's going to get a lot out of this group of players. I could see them taking a leap. I don't think it's going to be significant. It might be a game or two above them in the standings, but my pick is Chicago for last in the division.
Yeah, I just look at it and I go, okay, the Levine thing, it doesn't seem like they're trying to repair things. Joe Cali of the Sun-Times did report that Billy Donovan went to LA to meet with Levine. So maybe they're trying to mend that fence. But if they're trying to mend it, they're only trying to mend it to get him to play well so they can trade him. Vucevic very clearly isn't going to finish this contract with the Bulls. They're going to try and move him as well. And they're going young. And it's Kobe White, and it's Modest Buzelis, and it's Ayo Dosunmu, and it's Patrick Williams, who they just gave $200 million to. And I like all those guys. But those kind of young teams typically don't win. I think maybe the loss of DeRozan might be a little overstated, but this team also very clearly to me, like they've signaled that they're trying to go young. They're just having a hard time pulling it off because of the contracts that they have on. They're trying to go young. And if that's the case, they're going to get to January. And if you're on pace for 38 wins and the play-in tournament 10 seed, would you rather pursue that? And it's Reisendorf, so there's always questions, Reinsdorf, but it's a question worth asking. If you get there, wouldn't you rather just pursue Cooper Flagg? Like, wouldn't you try and do everything to get Cooper Flagg or Ace Bailey? Like, there just seems to be way more reason, and they've already started that process. If you had kept DeRozan, okay, sure, push as much as you can. You have a roster that you're trying to win with, but they're not. And so I'm with you. I think that I am very high on Detroit. Within reason. I don't think the Pistons are making the playoffs, but I think that they jump. I think it's possible that they finish with wins in the 30s with momentum towards next season. They're going to have actual NBA players next to Cade Cunningham. I actually like the structure of the team quite a bit. There's some numbers under the radar that if you kind of dig in, you're like, they for a team that lost 28 games in a row, not bad. Which I think is promising for them. So yeah, I think Detroit is Detroit's also my pick for the frisky team. I just think that they're going to be much more of a pain to play this season. I'm a big Cade Cunningham believer. I think that he made a real leap last season in terms of his jumper started to fall. His finishing at the rim is still really poor, but I went back and I actually did the film work on Cade, and so much of his problems at the rim were like Monty Williams was so checked out. Like there was just no structure. It was just very much like, yeah, try and get past that guy. When it's like one of the best it was like Jalen Suggs. And it's like, what, why are you ISOing Cade versus the best defenders in the league instead of getting him in pick and roll action with Duran or Stewart? Like the lack of structure was so poor. And I think that there'll be better spacing this season, and Cade will take higher percentage looks, and that'll improve his percentages. And he's a really great passer already. So having Malik Beasley and Tobias Harris, I think, is going to help. I actually like this roster quite a bit. So they're my pick for the frisky team in this division. David, what do you think?
I can't disagree there. Like this was so hard to pinpoint because they're not going to be great, but they are going to be, in terms of what you tend to think of in the NBA circles as frisky. They're a team that you don't want to really face because they're going to compete a lot more than you. They're not going to be penciled in as the obvious win anymore. They're not going to be never as bad as they were last season. Certainly, I think they're promising. But then you look at, if they're not division winners and you're looking at what Cleveland and Indiana are capable of, can you count them as frisky, or are they just too good to be frisky? Like, they're already kind of penciled in as they're going to be a darn good team. And so you kind of have to just leave them as such. So I like the pick. I like the Detroit choice. I had a hard time picking that because it was just, there's so many teams there. I think Milwaukee's going to be the clear division winner. But other than that, I think all the other teams, with the exception of Chicago, are going to be challenging to a certain degree. But in terms of kind of a team you just don't want to face, that they're not going to be the doormat that they've been in the past, I could certainly see Detroit getting that nod.
I'm a little low on Indiana. I was very high on them last season. I'm a little low on Indiana relative to expectation right now. I will say I like a lot of the early vibe buzz coming out of there. Stuff like Jarris Walker working with Pascal Siakam, like Siakam making an invested effort to get guys into his gym and work with him. Like that, those are little things that I'm like, oh, I like that. Like I think Tyrese Halliburton, even though he didn't do anything for Team USA, the experience of playing with Team USA, guys will always talk about how transformational it was for them, in part because you get to see how hard the other guys you're competing against are working. And so you understand what you need to put in. Like he got to see LeBron in the gym during conditioning and in practice. He got to see Steph doing that stuff. And those things I think will shape Halliburton and make him better when he's already, in my opinion, underrated as one of the best offensive engines in the league. Like I think there's a possibility that I will say my vibe meter, my stock meter for Indiana went from a very neutral to maybe maybe a little bit worse. And now I'm like, hey, I think there's some upside here. Like they might actually benefit from this conference finals appearance. They're not
going to catch people by surprise the same way they did last year too. Like I felt like that was such a huge factor, especially with that offense being as potent as it was. They're going to put up 140. They might give up 139, but etc. I don't know that's going to have the same impact as this year, but they're still going to be so darn good.
They've just got to figure out how to figure out how to take how they played in the playoffs with that kind of intensity and translate it into a regular season form where you've got to be just a little bit more serious defensively. Not a lot. Your offense is good enough. You don't not gonna be a top 10 defense, but just don't be abysmal, and that'll take him pretty far. That's going to do it for Locked On NBA for a Tuesday. Thanks for joining us. You can check out the show tomorrow with John Corrales and Jake Madison, Pat the Designer, and Nick Angstadt on Thursday, and Wes Goldberg and Adam Mares on Friday. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you guys again next time here on Locked On NBA.